Welcome everyone to this third in the series being run by the Indonesia Project of interviews with eminent Indonesianists. And today it's my great pleasure, I'm Greg Fealy, and it's my great pleasure to introduce really one of the doyens of Indonesian studies in Australia, in fact globally, but particularly for ANU. So Emeritus Professor A.H. Johns, better known to his friends and colleagues as Tony Johns, really was the father of Asian studies at the Australian National University. And he's had an extraordinary career, not only long service to the university, but a tremendous contribution to the study of Southeast Asia history, culture, and particularly religion. I think he's probably best known for his scholarship on Islam in the region. So it's a great pleasure to talk to you today, Tony, and to learn much more of your life and your academic high points, if I can put it that way.
Well, I hope that it's coloured TV and I can see him blushing. That's quite so.
Well, perhaps we might begin by asking you about your background, and we want to sort of move gradually to the point of how you came to be so immersed in Southeast Asian studies. But tell us about your early life in England and your education, and then we'll move on from there.
Well, from the beginning, I like to imagine a story that I have ancestors who fled from Russia in 1860 from a pogrom, because the name Johns is an artificial name. The proper name is Nashinsky, and perhaps this family moved from Moscow to Poland, from Poland to Hungary. And in fact, I still have a cousin twice removed who lives in Budapest, who I realized, but my paternal grandfather moved to England, set up business as a tailor. And when he registered, his name was Janos Nashinsky. And they said, can't cope with that. Janos, that's John, but Nashinsky, no, it was John Johns. And that is how the name came. And I was born in Wimbledon and grew up there and had a relatively conventional secondary school, at an English grammar school, English literature, Latin, French. I was never much good at maths, but the English was quite considerable. 7 Shakespeare plays, Chaucer, Keats, Hopkins, whole range of poetry and prose. And what could I add after that? Quite a lot of Latin, Livy, Virgil, Tacitus, well, the usual package which came with an English grammar school education. At the beginning of war, I was evacuated to Plymouth, which was thought to be less liable for bombing than London. And I owe in tremendous debt to my paternal grandfather, who had a library, and in the library it had 7 pillars of wisdom, and at the age of 11 I've read with fascination 7 pillars of wisdom, and had an underlying influence, never realized at first, of what Islam was. But to continue, after graduating from high school, I was conscripted into the British Army. In the British Army, I was tested and sent to the Royal Army Ordnance Corps. This was in 1946. In the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, I was selected to be sent overseas, and I thought to myself, perhaps, hopefully, perhaps Egypt, perhaps Syria,
but instead to Singapore, to what was then Malaya. And I was, in a sense, disappointed. Not the world of Islam, I thought. It was only later I was to discover that Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia were as much a gateway to Islamic life and civilization from the point of view of Australia as Egypt and the Middle East were for Europe or for Britain. Well, I became a corporal in the British Army. I was able to clear a Bren gun in 20 seconds. I could present arms. I could shoulder arms. I could even fire a rifle with a reasonable degree of accuracy, at least to hit the target. But most of my work there was, a bit sneakily acquired, I suppose, was teaching English as a foreign language to locally recruited Malay soldiers. And it was in teaching them and my experience and closeness with them that I became interested in Indonesia. And going on from that, I was able to share with them some of the Islamic celebrations, like the Eid al-Adha, where I was taken to meals with them and listened to the service in the mosque, listened to people chanting Allahu Akbar. And after I was demobilized, I went to School of Oriental and African Studies and thought I would learn Malay as an honours subject and Arabic as a subsidiary subject. This was, in one sense, disappointing because Malay was taught by a man who had been a resident in Malaya for 20 or 30 years and who knew the language, but he had all the attitudes and mentality of colonial civil servant. And he also had what would seem to be now eccentric ideas of what was good Malay. So the course I took didn't study any text more modern than 1848. And he thought that the purest form of Malay was written in the 17th century, a work called the Sejarah Melayu. And he collected, or he also helped in the publication of Malay folk stories, which were not in their original form, but which had been bowdlerized and, or what should one say, abbreviated by Winstead, who thought the original form of them was too florid and had no shape and was boring. So in fact I had no real understanding of what Malay literature was or what the heritage was at all. When I had an oral examination, it was conducted by 3 British ex-civil servants, all over the age of 70. This is 1952, remember, and all aged over 70, and they spoke to me and expected me to reply as a deferential Malay speaking to a European superior.
It sounds a very colonial experience.
Very colonial experience. After that, somehow, because of my interest in Islam, I thought, Sufism, I'll study something Sufi in Malay for a PhD. But then, of course, I hadn't realized that the word, as a friend of mine, an American friend of mine, put it, the word Sufism was a European invention used by Europeans to appropriate something about Islam that they liked, so that it was an invented abstract noun. Now, after that, I got a text I could study, recommended from Holland, which was a series of tracts of Sufi thought in the 17th century, in which I duly transcribed, duly read about, wrote a very inadequate introduction. The English translation was perhaps adequate, I wouldn't say more than that. But it never occurred to me how inadequate this was and how little this actually taught me about what the Sufi tradition was. But while doing this, I supported myself by teaching English as a foreign language, actually teaching English mostly part-time and trying to get my thesis done in between. The thesis was passed, it was published. I'm a bit embarrassed it was published as it was, because I think now that it would probably be summarised into perhaps a 10-page article. But among the students learning English in England, students from abroad, mostly from Europe, but a couple from Indonesia, and I met a couple of Indonesians and by chance came across one of the earliest anthologies of modern Indonesian writing, Gemah Tanah Air, which had collections of short stories and poems and essays, and it was simply captivating. And I became more and more interested in Indonesia and looking for ways and means of getting into Indonesia. And eventually a chance arose. In Indonesia, I think in 1950, 1952, there was a decision to transfer first foreign language being Dutch to first foreign language being English. And this led to a project financed by the Ford Foundation to train Indonesian teachers of English. Now, I've been teaching English for 4 years. I taught English as a foreign language for a couple of years when I was a British soldier conscript. And this gave me, I had some idea of what Indonesia was going to be like, taking into account my experience in Johor Bahru in Malaya. And so I got appointed to this wonderful position. First for 2 years, which I spent in Bukit Tinggi. I didn't really want to go to Bukit Tinggi, but it turned out from many points of view to be a work in disguise, because it resulted in finding a wife of 65 years now, having 5 children, 13 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren still counting. And of course I learned a reasonable amount about Indonesian culture, the Indonesian dialect, and then spent a couple of years in Indonesia learning something about 17th century Javanese and modern Javanese retelling of Hindu stories like story of Rama and so on. And then various possibilities of coming to Australia, thought of Sydney, thought of Melbourne, but for some reason we came to visit Canberra to have a look, found a couple of people I'd already known at SOAS in London, and although at 1954 it was perhaps looks the least promising of places to go to, Canberra University College and so on, not even a university, the degrees it gave were degrees at Melbourne University, but it turned out to be serendipitous, because I think it has, I don't like to use the word outshone, but certainly showed itself certainly the equal of what developed in Melbourne, in Monash, or in Sydney.
So why Australia rather than, for example, returning to England or indeed settling permanently?
Well, I
in
wasn't
Indonesia?
particularly interested in returning to England. Nothing in the Indonesian world or in Malay world was of any interest. I'd met people from Australia. I'd met Jamie Mackey. I had met Jim Davidson, who came visiting, and I thought, oh, Australians aren't barbarians after all. And I didn't realise that he was a New Zealander at the time, because my mother was very anxious. She said, Australians are rather rough, but Indonesians are gentlemen. I mean, you get the myths of which formed in Britain about people in the colonies.
Cultural stereotypes.
Yeah, and I showed, to give some idea of, I was working in a travel agency before I took up teaching English as a foreign language. And I met a couple of people, university students. So one girl student, she was at university. I don't know what subject she was studying, and I showed some pictures. And she looked at Malay and says, oh, Pekingese. But Britain in 1952, between 1952 and 1954.
So you eventually shifted, relocated to Canberra.
So I relocated to Canberra, and we arrived, I think, on the 1st of August 1958 with just one son. And we were taken well from Professor Joe Burton, who was the principal of Canberra University College, and he had arranged for a grant from one of the American foundations, not Ford Foundation, but for me to go around the world and see other places where Indonesia was taught. So I went to San Francisco, to Cornell, to Yale, dropped in at the Centre for Islamic Studies in Montreal, went to London, went to Leiden, and I think from there back to Singapore and Indonesia and back to Canberra, having collected some ideas of the way in which people looked at Indonesia, looked at teaching Indonesian. Now this is leaving me talking for a long time and running out of breath. But one of the things I should talk about London is the utter contempt these had for Indonesia and for the language and for literature and for dictionaries used for teaching Indonesian.
That's in contrast. Was Malay regarded in the
oh
same
yes,
way?
I regarded Malay as perfect.
Southeast Asia. Oh,
and
right.
everything in Indonesia was corruption.
Mm-hmm.
So, which wasn't. In fact, I met a student or a PhD student who studied there 4 or 5 years later, who was so indoctrinated that he went to Malaya to do a research project, and he went to perhaps University of Malaya, and he said, this isn't the proper language, they're speaking Indonesian here. So went and hid himself and did some kind of project based in a village, which he felt was insulated from Indonesian influence. I mean, if you want an anecdote, I think he learned better as the time goes on. And I should add that one of my fellow students, who was a year ahead of me, Cyril Skinner, became a founder of Professor of Indonesian language in Monash.
Yes.
Unfortunately, he is no longer with us. Well, starting then, didn't know how to start. It was beginning from scratch. Teaching in the college and Canberra University College had been started thanks to Robert Menzies. I think in 1954 he had decided well, Australia is in the region of Asia. He wanted to develop Indonesian language courses. So there were language courses in Chinese, Japanese, and Indonesian in Melbourne and in Sydney. And because of the Canberra University College, and because there were public servants working there, and because there were foreign affairs people working there, they should have these languages available in
the capital as well.
In the capital at the Canberra University College. This was before the amalgamation of Canberra University College with the ANU. And they had started some Indonesian language teaching by an Indonesian public servant. He was in the Department of Education, but he was brought to Canberra by what they called Colombo Aid in Reverse. In Colombo Aid in Reverse, yeah. So submitted, financed by the Indonesian government for him to teach there. And that was the situation, if you like, story of Peter and the Wolf. After all, the narrative has been given. This was how things stood.
So what year did Indonesian begin at the Canberra University College?
It was perhaps taught beginning 1956, I think, but not a degree level. It wasn't recognised by the University of Melbourne. And I think it was just called Introductory Indonesian. It wasn't formally approved until 1959.
So you mentioned that the Menzies government was supporting the study of Asia and the Pacific, but within this sort of nascent Asian studies environment at ANU, how was Indonesian regarded there? You've mentioned that in England, Indonesia didn't have a particularly prestigious reputation. What about within so-called Oriental studies?
Well, when I first came to the School of Oriental Studies, they called the unit for Chinese, Japanese, Indonesian. There was some resentment on other parts, not serious resentment, in the other parts of the college or the faculties or School of General Studies or whatever it was called, that this was taking funds from their living. Although in fact it was a special grant from the Department of Education. But secondly, in some areas there was a feeling that Chinese and Japanese were real Oriental languages, whereas Indonesian. And I had exchanged a correspondence with a man from Hobart I think it was in the Australian, saying he thought all this stuff about Asian languages was rather silly, that the Japanese weren't going to buy more, or Tasmania wasn't going to be able to flog more apples to Japan just because people in Australia learned Japanese. The only reason for learning Japanese was to get into touch with some good literature. I don't know how broad his generalisation was.
But also to make money out of
to make money out of
if you learned a language, the objective was to actually, for Australian prosperity.
But of course there are other reasons for learning a language than commercial ones, or even for being able to read the Tale of Genji in the original. But because there are people, there are traditions, there are ways of living, there is everyday intercourse and recognition of one's neighbours. If you are reading, if you're in France, you don't learn French just to be able to read Victor Hugo. You want to be able to talk to your next door neighbour, and lots of things flow from that.
So the decision then to found a Faculty of Asian Studies or Oriental Studies initially at ANU, can you tell us a little bit about how difficult that was, what sort of student demand there was, how much support from government university?
That wasn't so much of a problem. It came more or less by chance, because there was, first of all, you had the old-style Australian National University. Beside it, you had the Canberra University College. The Australian National University had a School of Far Eastern History with, I think, Fitzgerald, I forget. And of course, there was School of Pacific Studies as well. The Canberra University College had its School of Oriental Studies. With amalgamation, there was a need to have some form by which the work in the ANU, the Australian National University, could be pursued and combined with what was done in the School of Asian Studies. And the way of solving this was to put them together and say they were all members of... No, they weren't members. They were... there was a Faculty of Asian Studies, which would not be tied to the Faculty of Arts, but which could have a free association with Fitzgerald's department. And a committee was formed. It never met. And if people wanted to do a higher degree in this, it was still called the Faculty of Asian Studies, they would have to register in the School of Advanced Studies to do the degree. And this, I think, was not changed until about 40 years ago, if I remember properly.
So were there lots of students? Was this did this grow rapidly, this new faculty?
In I think 1961, 62, or 1961, perhaps 3 or 4 students. In 1962, the subdean told me, oh, there's a plethora. And by 1963, I think we had 40 or 50 first-year students.
Around about what we get in first year now for ANU, Indonesian studies. So, yeah.
But this is not for Indonesian studies, this is for language.
Language, yeah.
Because I think the most useful thing, or one of the things I'm happy I did, was to say I'm not having a studies department with multidisciplines. A discipline is a discipline, a language is a language. Now I'm hoping that people who know the language will teach the disciplines, people who know the area. But I didn't want to create an Indonesian or a Malaysian world. And I think it worked out. So that Indonesian had the same rights as Chinese or Japanese, and had the scope to start the teaching of Thai, which we managed to do also by Colombo Clanade in reverse. And it was by that time that I was able to get my first Indonesian colleague. This was Subardi. For some reason, he had to have 2 names, so he called himself Subakin Subardi, who was a marvellous first appointment. And in fact, I think up till 1967, 68, all my colleagues were Indonesian. And the flood of students created an opportunity for Johanni to take part as a teacher, and gave her the scope to write
your wife,
yes, to write language course textbooks, which were the norm for I think about 10 or 15 years, which I even saw on bookshelves in Changi Airport in Singapore.
I remember learning from them when I was at Monash University. What were the challenges for those early days of Asian studies at ANU and particularly Indonesian studies? When you reflect back on them, the development of those fields, do you think that you're happy with how they developed, or what kind of challenges did they face?
Well, I don't think when you live through things which are challenges, you often forget about them or don't notice what the challenge was. But I don't think we had a challenge. We had Sukarno, and it was Sukarno's magic personality in his oratory and his threat of taking over New Guinea, which prompted Australia to buy F-111s or something, which really resulted in an ever-growing plethora of students.
Just on the Sukarno factor, Tony, sorry to interrupt, but one of the things that's often said, for example, about the Indonesian invasion, takeover of East Timor, was that it deterred a lot of students. It had a negative effect on Indonesian studies in Australia because the Australian public responded very badly to that. But in the 60s, even though Sukarno increasingly was seen as a threat in Australian eyes, it seems to have done no harm to the enrolments and the interest in Indonesian studies.
Yes, and there were lots of Australians who went to go to work in Indonesia. I forget what the scheme was called. I know that Hearle Fealy was one of them.
Australian Volunteers Abroad was one of those.
Yes, Australian Volunteers Abroad. And people came back just fascinated. How else should I put it? I tried to make the basis of the course, and of course it was with colleagues as well. First of all, the modern Indonesian language, and then to offer particular foci for people who wanted to do honours work. So that we gave courses in Javanese. We offered a course at a time for Sundanese. Later, I was able to offer a course in Minangkabau, and for students who were perhaps interested in the Hindu-Javanese period, because Professor de Jong and the Department of Buddhist Studies, it was possible to have two students doing a short course in Sanskrit as part of the material to do their research, not as a substitute for it, but simply to open doors. And for myself, I gave a 2-hour-a-week course in Arabic, which in fact did not produce much more than an ability to use an Arabic-English dictionary with some confidence, because you can't use an Arabic dictionary without knowing the grammar of the words which you are looking up, because of the vast number of, because of the, how should I put it, because of a 3-word radical with a whole plethora, forgive the word again, of infixes and affixes to indicate particular variety of forms, to translate, to transfer nouns to verbs, from nouns to adjectives, to transfer verbs from being intransitive to transitive, and then sometimes even to give them the opposite meaning.
So could you tell us actually a little bit about you learned Arabic yourself, and then you began teaching it, and you made Islamic studies an important element in Asian studies at ANU, which I think made ANU unique, perhaps in Australia, and it can't have been many other places in the world that did that. So tell us, because you talked about your interest in Islam and reading the 7 Pillars as a child, and then being with Malays during the Second World War, but how did this develop academically for you? Where did you learn Arabic, and why did you make this decision that Islam should be a core part of Southeast Asian studies?
Well, simply because, well, I'm not quite sure at what point to begin to answer the question. But first of all, 89% of the Muslims, of the inhabitants of Indonesia, are Muslims. that they live according to the Muslim timetable, celebrate the Muslim festivals. Practically everyone who is a Muslim will, what they call tamat Quran, or having made a complete study of the Quran as part of their informal education, of recognizing the skills and the learning of many of the ulama in Indonesia. And it sent me to, I realized very rapidly how insignificant my little PhD thesis and what I had learned from it was, and how inadequate it was. But it set me to want to learn not just what was written in Indonesian or the popular works of religious teachers, but to go to the Middle East, to go to Cairo, and to study the teachers of the teachers of Indonesians. And it was there that I found myself drawn more and more into Arabic and picking up more and more Arabic. And it was, of course, a traumatic experience at first. But I was at the American University in Cairo for 1 year. I had some friends I met from the Azhar, and one of them, I had taken with me a manuscript which was used by, what is the man, Adnan Obel. You know the name, I've written it down somewhere and it keeps slipping my mind. At the Islamic State University in Jakarta. But I wrote it in pen.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, but anyhow, I found, thanks to him, that the only manuscript I had come from Leiden. It belonged to Skrukuronio, which was regarded with a special reference. This friend of mine found 4 more manuscripts of it in Cairo libraries, and I met a Syrian scholar who told me, you have to go to Istanbul. And it was for this information in later years, which I had been discussing with this Indonesian scholar, which were responsible for his most recent work, which was a marvellous edition of the Arabic text with various readings, an Indonesian translation of the Arabic. Mm. And since it was a text in which I had examples of the author talking to Jawi, to Indonesian scholars, Mukims in Mecca and in Medina, that it was most appropriate that it should be an Indonesian who made this translation. Well, that was an experience which I came back with happily. Although, if you want an anecdote, we were locked in our apartment by a voracious Egyptian landlord who wanted to screw out of us an additional £100 or so of rent, which was quite outside of the contract. And we had a servant with us, and a crowd gathered outside the front door, and our servants made a speech on our behalf, saying what wonderful people we were to work with. And then another tenant in the same building, a rather heavily built French lady who I'd helped up a flight of stairs the day before, telephoned the police. But we had with us at the same time the wife of the Australian chargé d'affaires.
Yeah.
So you can let your imagination run wild and imagine headlines in the Canberra Times.
It turned into an incident, yes.
but it didn't happen, and we were happily reduced. Well, I got back to Canberra, happy, relieved, and I wrote an exciting report on my study leave saying how wonderful I thought it. The first one I sent in was, it's too long. So I just put it in one line instead of 1.5 line intervals, and it was on short, it looked briefer, and it was just accepted and put away. I mean, it is a bit disappointed if you have something exciting and then no one is interested. But my dear colleague Subadi was interested, and when he came back from his study leave, he brought me a 2-volume exegesis of the Quran by a man called Nawawi al-Badtani.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, this is interesting. Yeah. And the man was called the Sayyid Ulama al-Hijaz. In other words, the Lord of the learned of the Hijaz. In other words, it is an Indonesian in the late 19th century who has made the big time in Mecca. His book, published in Cairo, republished in Indonesia and so on, used by Arabic-speaking Muslims. And it enabled me to realize in a way I hadn't read before that Indonesia was an integral part of the Muslim world. And there are some anthropologists who I will not name, who wrote learned articles talking about the relation between the heartland and the periphery and so on. There is no periphery. Indonesia is not a periphery. And simply applying categories which he thought of European and Christianity in Europe to the Islamic world. But more important than that, I found in this book a reference to, as being a very good scholar, he named the authorities who he had relied on, and a man called Arazi. And there are dozens of Arazis in Islamic history, of course, but this was one who died in 1210. And his exegesis of the Quran is 32 volumes. And when I was next in Cairo, I thought, that's interesting, I'll see what he has to say. And then I thought, yes, I'm interested in the story of Joseph. What does this man, this great Iranian, he was Iranian scholar, because Razi, and I was completely transfixed. And then I found from him, an interest in the figures of some of the great, what are called prophets of Islam, in his thesis, and I began writing at them. And this led me more to think more and more of the Quran and to study the Quran more closely and to realize that to get a feel of what the Quran is, there is no alternative but to memorizing a number of surahs. And then you are unfettered from the printed page, and the words can do their own business. And this is what led me to introduce a topic. So I'm afraid I just want to show what doors studying Indonesia and the Indonesian language opened. And so I first started a course on Indonesian on Islamic civilizations. And then I also, which is now Islamic history and institutions, which I used to teach before I retired with Tony Street. And then I introduced a course which was quite popular. I got 20 students a year regularly, called the Quran in Translation. Now, of course, translation, you'll put a word in italics, of course, but at least so that students could understand something of what motivated Indonesians and what was important in Indonesian society and what so many Indonesian children studied as part of their informal training.
Tony, that decision, if I can just interject for a moment, I still remember your farewell conference, was it 1993 or 94 at ANU? And even at that point, there were some of the speakers who bemoaned the fact that you had concentrated so much on Arabic and that this was a loss for Indonesian studies and Malay studies per se. Was that a view that you encountered quite a bit?
Well, people perhaps were too polite to say so, but I've made a note here saying that I felt, what could I say? I felt guilty about it. But how do I put? I can never find. I almost feel like I found it. Yes, I'm sure a parliamentarian would have the same problems. I almost felt I felt guilty at spending so much doing it, perhaps, but not very. I think it made clear a particular dimension of Indonesia which might otherwise have been missed. And I think that of the Arabic program, there were 5 people who got PhDs. Now, 2 of them, Dennis Walker, or 3 of them, and Tony Street and Laurie Fitzgerald, were interested in theological problems, but 2 of them, Mike Laffin,
Princeton,
who is a historian and who used his knowledge of Arabic, which he traced Indonesian scholars and communities over various parts of the world, who is now a full professor in Princeton. And also another man, Peter Riddell, who is now retired, who has published the oldest manuscript, or one of the oldest manuscripts of a Quran exegesis, which perhaps was found in Aceh, I think, in 1601. And he has transcribed, published, translated, analysed and sought its context in a marvellous book published by Brill, a text which had been waiting to be studied, of extraordinary importance if you wanted to learn about the origins of Islam in Indonesia and the earlier history, because so much is lost, so much has disappeared, sometime by accident, by storm, Raffles' ship, the flame, burnt up and sank. What else had happened? The flame sank. Ranieri burnt lots of things. And the climate. But there is so much which has got lost. And one of the things I have discovered is that among the texts I was reading were Malay translations of a man called Shamsuddin from the year 1600 and so on. And most of the Dutch scholars had disregarded it, and then realized that he had written an Arabic work which had not been studied, called Jawhar al-Haqa'iq, which must have been written about 1570, a work which is marvellous in its religious passion, in its the breadth of its learning, in its psychology, and it just takes the breath away. And I've showed it to professional Arabists who says this is the same class which you expect of Islamic scholars. There's nothing inferior or nothing in
peripheral
about
about
it, because it is from Indonesia. And a Dutch scholar who published some of his Malay works had read through this and found a marvellous line of verse from one of the greatest Javanese Arab mystics called Ibn al-Farid. And there was a quotation from it, and he just puts as a footnote, obviously very corrupt. Not corrupt at all, he just hadn't understood it. There was a mistake, one minor mistake, I think, a feminine for a masculine in one syllable. So that is something which, having gone that far into the Indonesian world, into the Arab world, takes me back with more insights into the Indonesian world.
Can I ask about, I'm just mindful of the time, ask about what you think of you have an enormous list of publications and on a great many fields, exegesis and Southeast Asian Islamic history and the like, and cultural texts. It might be a difficult question, but to ask you, what works do you value most highly now? What aspect of your scholarship do you look back on with the most pride?
Well, not very many, but there is one thing which does give me a great pleasure, and that is that I published a chapter in this book on prophets and personalities. Prophets and personalities in the Quran.
It's the Oxford Handbook of Quranic Studies for anyone interested in looking further.
Which was published in 2020.
And why did you particularly regard that highly?
Because it was the fruit of all of the papers and all of the reading I had done about the prophetic figures in the Quran, and to which I had been introduced by, I call him my guide, Fakhruddin Arazi.
Yeah. And I spoke in the past tense when I talked about your academic achievements, but in actual fact, you're still at the age of 93, you're still active in research, aren't you, Tony?
I hope so, yes.
Working on a translation of the works of Al-Ghazali, for example.
My work of Al-Ghazali on the rightness of music and ecstasy. Al-Ghazali thinks that in the proper circumstances, singing, dancing, poetry and music are right, and they're a reasonable activity. There are occasions when you might be wrong, But when there are occasions to celebrate, like the return of a visitor, at the cutting of the hair of a child, at completion of the study of the Quran, at a festival, all these things are right. And most of the things which are condemned situationally. So some of the things, such as particular musical instruments, because they are associated with drinkers and sinners. And what would life be in Indonesia if it had the kind of a spirituality of Saudi Arabia? I mean, where would Indonesians be without singing? And this is what Ghazali provides. In fact, he uses some of the arguments for some singing, which the Saudis try to use against it in the present day. And he takes verses of the Quran and proves wrong in his system what the Saudis take. So he was really on the side of the angels. And if I have finished, well, I haven't finished yet, but what I'm trying to do, I hope to have published a collection of papers in the past. I think 7 of them are on Islamic topics. 2 of them have to do with Islam in Indonesia, and it's been published by the Australian Theological Forum. And I had a friend in Britain to make to calligraph the title, which I took from an Arabic verse of Baqarah 138, called it "The Dye of God." And the calligrapher showed me, I didn't put it in his mind, but he showed me that here is a verse of the Quran. What is it? Where are we? وَمَنْ أَحْسَنَ مِنَ اللَّهِ صِبْرًا وَنَحْنُ لَهُ عَابِدُونَ. Which, how wonderful is the dye of God, and we adore him. And he took the verse and he put the word Allah in the middle, so divided the verse, and there's a theological statement that Allah is central. And it's a thought, an aspect of calligraphy I hadn't realized, that it makes a theological emphasis. It's not just elaboration in place of making pictures of people or so on, but it can communicate a message. And as my grandfather used to say, if I'm spared, I would like to go back to Shamsuddin. I'd like to go back to his work, which I think is in the, which I guess at, in 1570. And Nawawi did a marvellous, most useful exegesis in the end of the 19th century. Here, 200 years earlier, here in Shamsuddin is a great scholar. He was Sheikh al-Islam of the Sultan of the Sultanate of Aceh, and he was Sheikh al-Islam over 5 sultans. And how appropriate that a man in that rank, and Aceh being that great state, should have such a marvellous work in Arabic at his fingertips.
Tony, it seems as if that's a very appropriate moment to end the interview. Thank you. It's always fascinating to hear your insights and to witness your erudition on not only Indonesia in general, but particularly on Islamic topics. So it's been a real privilege to talk to you, Tony, and thank you for allowing us into your house and for making the time. As has been evident, you've made some notes, you've thought very carefully about what you wanted to say. It has really been an extraordinary career, an extraordinary contribution to Australian and to global understandings of Indonesia and Islam, and we're very pleased you're able to give the time to tell us a little bit about your career and your scholarship, and long may it continue, I must say. And thank you again, Tony.
Thank you.